reminded me 26 years. And I was here before he was. His BA is from Princeton. His medical degree is from Pitt. He has a master's degree in public health as well from Johns Hopkins. His medical field is pediatrics. He's practiced pediatrics in Colorado at Case Western, and when he first got here, up at Primary Children's, in addition to being in the Department of Pediatrics. He's a former chair of SACHARP, the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Research Ethics, and he's the current chair of a committee of the National Academies on return of research results to participants in clinical studies. And without anything more, I'm going to give you Jeff. I think he knows that we kind of have a formal part of the program for somewhere between about 4:15 and 4:30, something like that. And then we break for time for socializing and refreshments.
Very good.
Okay.
Well, thank you. What a privilege to be part of this Colloquium series. And I've know a number of the folks that have been part of the series. Haven't been able to participate yet myself, but it's a real honor. And certainly an honor to work with Leslie and Tennille over all of these years. We've had a great collaboration through the now program in medical ethics and humanities in the Department of Internal Medicine. So this topic today is the subject of our National Academies Committee. Our report is due this summer. So I will not be telling you what we're going to say because we haven't said it yet. But it'll be a nice teaser for you, so you'll be...
But you know what you're going to say.
We're getting close. It's an interesting dynamic to see the different personalities on the committee and the different perspectives on this. So this really is one of the more controversial issues in medicine, biomedical research right now. And for reasons that I'm going to explain to you, there's some complexities here. Ethical complexities, certainly some regulatory complexities that may be particularly of interest to this group. But some real challenging concepts to think through as medicine and the research enterprise evolve over time. So I have a couple of cases to pose to you at the beginning. And I'm going to stop after I present the case here, see if anybody has any questions about the factual nature of the case, and then I'm going to take a vote. So we'll see how folks respond to these three cases I have. So you're in an academic laboratory, scientist, working with a large family, looking for genes associated with increased risk of breast and ovarian cancer. Okay, pretty familiar story here at the University of Utah. Genes identified in which mutations are highly associated with cancer in the family. Success. Results have been published, but they've not been replicated yet. Nobody else out there has verified that your findings are in fact correct. Now, individual results have not been returned to family members, both because of the lack of replication here, and your laboratory as an investigator is not CLIA certified. Now, folks familiar with that terminology, clinical laboratory improvement amendments? So for the most part, the notion here is unless you are CLIA certified as a laboratory, you don't disclose results to participants. So that's the standard. We'll talk more about that here in a little bit. So investigators, however, learned that a 38-year-old woman in the family has scheduled a prophylactic mastectomy to reduce her risk of breast cancer. And you happen to know that she doesn't carry the genetic variant that you have identified as being associated with the disease. All right, so what are you going to do as an investigator? Any questions about the sort of facts of the case first?
Yeah, and a final point, Jeff. So does the investigator know that that woman has no mutation, or just that she doesn't have the mutation interest of BOCH.
She has no
She's clean bill of
identifiable
health.
mutation within the gene that they've identified as being associated with cancer. So they don't have any reason to believe that she's at increased risk. She thinks she is because she's in this high-risk kindred.
What did they tell her?
They, as part of the consent process,
Yeah,
yeah, they told her, we're looking for this genes associated with breast and ovarian cancer, but we're not going to provide you with any results. Which is the standard, or has been the standard boilerplate for many years. All right, so investigators, you're all investigators now, so you're interested to know how many of you would go ahead and disclose the results in this circumstance. Get a non-confidential show of hands.
Well, with the proviso, I'd ask her first, if we have some information that might be relevant to you, would you be interested?
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
So this is really an underlying point for the whole talk, and I don't think I perhaps make it more strongly enough that what we're talking about here are offers of results. Pretty unusual unless it's a parent-child circumstance in which you would foist results on somebody who doesn't want it. So that would be the question. And you have to think about how to ask that. You know, we know something about you, would you be interested in knowing it too? Or-
Yeah, right.
So that becomes challenging, but it's an important point. So I'm sorry, a little higher on the hands here. How many are willing to give results out in this circumstance?
With this proviso,
Well, and go back
Yes.
to CLIA lab.
To offer her results, we
Yeah.
say, we know you're going for a mastectomy in a week. Would you be interested in knowing mutation status? Okay, I'm seeing maybe half the group. Okay. Anybody want to speak very quickly to why they think that's the better answer?
I mean, just what I'm thinking is, how does that affect the study telling her that she has diabetes? If it's not like developing some kind of like medication for her, she's not in the placebo group, like, if they're just identifying this gene, then what would it matter to tell this one lady that she
Okay.
doesn't have it?
I think what it would matter is that it's contrary to the regulations. You're not
Well,
supposed to,
that's where
you're not supposed to
me
be.
not being in this field is like, so,
I think it would allow her to make the most informed decision possible.
Okay.
She's also wild type, for what it's worth.
She's what?
She
Okay.
doesn't, she's wild type, she's normal. She
Right.
doesn't have the risk.
And so you feel she ought to know that?
Yeah.
I think I saw your hand up, yeah. Okay.
So one question on the regulations. So the fact that the lab is not CLIA certified means that they can be disclosed to her?
It cannot be
No, it
disclosed.
shouldn't be.
Should not be. Yeah, shouldn't be by, according to the regs. Yeah.
So if the lab were CLIA certified, I've heard that there is a prohibition on return results. Is that true, or am I getting
If the lab is CLIA certified, they can return results to be used for clinical purposes. So the lack of CLIA certification here, which many research labs are, as we talk, it's a very burdensome sort of process and expensive to get CLIA certified. So if you're just doing basic research, you don't normally get CLIA certification, unless you run into this problem.
So if the study said you were going to return results and you come up with this situation where there's a dilemma, I mean, why not call the IRB and get their take on if it's acceptable and get a genetic counselor involved that can do CLIA testing?
Okay, excellent idea. And others agree with the IRB review process. And in fact, that would be required anyhow in this circumstance, because if your IRB approved protocol said, we're not returning results to anybody, now all of a sudden you want to say, gosh, there's a situation's come up, we think we ought to be returning results, you'd go back to the IRB and try to get a quick amendment passed to go ahead and do that. But I think your other point perhaps was that the consent form said you weren't giving results back. And now you are going to make that offer. Is there a problem there?
Well, what would be the consequence for the lab if they did do this in terms of like their status? What negative consequence could happen?
I'm not sure I can give you a great answer to that. There can be sanctions, and my understanding here is that from CLIA's standpoint, it does not have to necessarily be a consistent pattern of breaching the rules. They will take a single example, and I believe there are financial penalties to violating CLIA that can be substantial. Yeah.
Does it matter how the investigators learned of this woman's self-help? action? Does it matter?
Well, they have all the data on all the participants in the study. And so they will have done a genome analysis for all of the participants. And what they'll do then is take people who've had cancer and not had cancer and see where the genetics seems to show that association.
But how did they learn she was planning to have this procedure?
Yeah, good question. And sometimes what
Or
these
after they
circumstances
did all this
pose is,
initial intake? Or
yeah, you may have a clinician who was the original interface with the laboratory research group. And the clinicians don't know her mutation status, but they know she's going to go for this procedure, and they're part of the institutional environment where
would that
information-
matter, though?
I'm sorry?
Would it matter how those investigators found out she was going to do this?
I don't
It's not part of
think
the
so,
research.
as long as it was part of their research project and they had legitimate access to the data from the analysis. Now, this is a real case. Oh, go ahead.
No, I don't.
Okay, this is a real case. And to some extent, started a lot of this conversation. It was an NIH set of investigators, and indeed they did relay this information to the young woman. All right, here's another case for you then. Investigators at the university conducting an observational study measuring pesticide levels in urine from farm workers and family members with a local non-farmer worker control population. Participants are farm workers, primarily Hispanic, with variable levels of English proficiency. Toxic level of pesticide in the system has been defined, but otherwise we don't know very much about what the health implications are of lower levels of pesticide exposure or chronic levels of chronic exposure to lower levels. We just don't understand yet what the health effects are. So given these uncertainties about the interpretation and health implications and also these sociocultural barriers, should individual results be communicated to the study participants? And here results are, what's your system level of a particular pesticide, chemical or chemicals? Clarifying questions?
So you're consenting patients for this?
Yes,
And
patients
so
are consented
did
to
your
it.
IRB say you'll return results?
Well, let's pose this question at the
I
time
mean,
the
your
investigators
consent.
are developing the protocol.
Sorry, I mean your consent, does your consent let the patients know or the participants know the results will be returned?
Yeah, I think for this case, what we're going to say is we don't know yet because it hasn't
Oh.
gone through IRB, and I'm trying to decide as an investigator,
Got
what's
it.
my plan?
Sorry.
And so is it appropriate to return results in this case? And if I think it is, I'll pose that to the IRB and see what the IRB has to say about that.
What is the aim of the study?
Mostly to see in this particular environment, given the known amount of pesticide being used in this particular agricultural environment, how much are individuals being exposed? To what extent are they using protective measures? To what extent are those protective measures effective? And is there a problem in this particular environment with exposure or not? So that's a sort of meta issue with how the chemicals are used in certain environments, and not so much a question of what are individual levels. You might have a different kind of study where you'd follow those individuals over time and see what their health impacts were, but this is more a matter of assessing environmental exposures.
Just a clarifying question. In that third point, it says the toxic level of pesticide in the system has been identified. The other statement there seems almost to contradict that. So this is a toxic level of a pesticide for which, I mean, that implies that toxic levels are understood and thus consequences are understood at some level. Is that what this is saying?
Yes.
Okay.
That we know, for example, that if you're 20 and over for this particular chemical, you may well have symptoms, and we can measure abnormalities in your kidney function, let's say, that is frequently associated with very high levels of this, and I'm making this up. But we don't know what 5 means, or what 5 means if you've been exposed to 5 for a year, or if you're exposed every summer when you're using pesticides, but off in the winter, that sort of thing. So the health implications for lower levels really aren't well understood. Okay, so how many folks here then, you're now investigators again, would encourage this investigator to plan to return individual results to these research participants? Okay, maybe about half the group or so. Anybody want to speak to why they think that's a better idea?
I mean, I think I would definitely tell them if they did have a toxic level of pesticides, especially if it could cause like adverse health outcomes.
Okay, good. Short of that, would you tell everybody, or would you just tell the folks who are red flagged?
I don't know. But for sure, the ones that are red flagged, I think I would definitely tell.
Okay.
I would also, I had a similar thought I would also do if they reach to a toxic level, but I think I would give results to everyone, considering if they're approaching that toxic level, maybe there's something that they can do in their, day-to-day procedures that can keep them off of that, even if we don't understand the effects right now, even if they can just be more precautious, or there could be more precautions taken during, their daily work, then maybe they don't get to that level.
Good. So what you're saying is that this information may well be actionable in some way.
Right.
They may decide to take the protective measures more seriously, or a part of the study included testing kids of the workers with the notion that are they bringing this home under clothes? Is there exposure for the babies and young children at home secondarily from that sort of thing? So there's action to be taken. Okay. Any other thoughts here? Yeah.
I think that probably giving results to everyone and allowing them to all have kind of a baseline test to have had run, and they have those numbers so that in the future if they start having symptoms, that's something they can retest for and see if like those levels have gone up and that's kind of what's causing it, or just help with the process of elimination down the road.
Okay. So other sorts of actions that are going to help them make decisions about their health and exposures. Now, not everybody thought disclosure was necessarily the best way to go. Anybody want to speak to that point of view? Yeah.
So I think I may feel differently about people with toxic levels, but I think in general, if you're going to study something like this, that there's a plan to provide education generally to everyone and not necessarily tell everybody their own individual results, but to provide some education about like you should wear gloves or wear a face mask, or just common things that everybody could do to protect themselves.
Okay. So you want to give something back to these folks in the way of helpful information about how to protect
but
themselves.
maybe more general information. I'm just thinking about studies I've worked on where there may not be resources to individually provide results to everyone, and this seems like a situation where everyone could benefit from some recommendations about how to.
Okay, good. And we're going to get back to that resource issue because it's a very real one. And one of the questions is, if you want to take up this enterprise in a serious way, to what extent does that impair your ability to do more research? Is there a trade-off there between the research enterprise and engaging participants in this way? Anybody else want to take a position about uncertainty or concern about disclosure? Yeah.
My concern would be, given the social cultural barriers, that the disclosure is adapted to individuals so they can actually understand the material that's being given, because then you want to make sure that it serves the purpose and not cause more harm than it intends.
Okay, excellent. And I'll tell you, and this isn't exactly giving away too much in terms of our forthcoming report, a huge section of the report is not about the whether to return, but how. And if you're going to do it, there are lots of folks who are quite knowledgeable about communication strategies that can be very helpful. We don't have a lot of research about this sort of thing, but enough to know better ways to do this sort of thing and less better ways. All right, I got a third case for you. Investigators obtained blood samples from pregnant women at 20 weeks gestation and placental samples following delivery in an attempt to characterize a new biomarker that's associated with placental dysfunction and preterm delivery. Okay, obviously important health problem. The biospecimens are collected, frozen, and analyzed at the end of the recruitment phase. Specimens from 240 women are collected over a 2-year period. Investigators identify a biomarker that's weakly associated with placental dysfunction or preterm delivery, but the association is not statistically significant. Any questions about the... All right, what do you think now? Let me see, how many hands for folks who are in favor of not disclosing these results? Okay, pretty much most folks, maybe a few outliers. Anybody want to speak to why?
Well, the biomarker is only weakly associated with the issues at hand, and not even statistically significant. So I don't think they can rightfully make any claim about the value of it.
Okay, so it's not meaningful information. Yeah.
Well, worse than not meaningful, I think you might scare people and cause them a lot of mental concern when you really aren't sure that this is a problem yet. I think you need more data before you potentially scare people like that.
Okay. So the risk of misinterpretation of information could be substantial, and that's a countervailing consideration to information.
Maybe more of a question. So it is heritable condition, biomarkers, because maybe she has sisters that could get pregnant, or children in the future, so therefore the information might be more relevant.
Yeah, this was using a more generic term than genetic, and it might well be not a genetic biomarker. It could be some other protein that arises in the system that you could measure that would be associated. All right. This one's completely made up, so I can't tell you what happened in this case. But certainly the lack of meaningful information is part of it. The burden. And in this particular case, you've got a biomarker that's relevant to a pregnancy that's now, for some of these women, a year old. Right? So it's a little bit less relevant than knowing what my pesticide exposure's been this last month. Right? How useful is that information? It gets back to that notion of actionability. If it doesn't have actionability, hard to interpret, and potentially could be misinterpreted. There are many investigators in this circumstance who are going to say that's a constellation of factors that's going to lead us not to disclose these results in this particular case. So we want to take a step back and think about what the core questions are here with this in this domain. What are the obligations of investigators to disclose individual research results in these cases and other sorts of cases? We're talking here about several types of potential disclosure. One is to offer results to everybody. Second would be disclose results upon the request of individuals, and that might be a different standard. And then there's issues around unanticipated findings. You stumble upon something that you didn't think you were going to find, and now you have to decide whether this is worth communicating or appropriate to communicate or not.
Is that last point even a valid point?
In what way?
Yes.
There are.
Yes, short answer.
When will there not be unanticipated findings? I mean, unanticipated findings in research seem like that's just the default for the most part. I mean, to suggest that there's never going to be unanticipated findings in research seems kind of silly to me.
Well, that's right. And this reminds me of the grant we sent in years ago where we were going to set up a committee to address unanticipated findings. And they said, what findings do you anticipate are unanticipatable? I said, okay, circular logic problem there. The question here is, given the fact that many research projects will have unanticipated findings, you still have to set up a standard to say which one of those merit communication to the participants and which ones do not. So that's the level of the question being posed here. And how do you decide that?
So it really means uncommon or rare and important.
We're probably not going to get into that level of detail here, but I think those would be attributes that would get your attention. In other words, you don't recognize unanticipated findings unless they are important and they seem to have implications for the individual involved. You might have lots of unanticipated things that you couldn't have predicted but have no relevance to the participant, and then this sort of question wouldn't arise. I'll show you some recommendations later from a President's Commission on these sorts of issues, and they have a whole set of terminology that they were proposing here, and part of the question is, there's certain findings that are uncommon, but you can anticipate. If you do whole genome sequencing on 100 people, you'll find 3, 4, 5% of those folks who have variants that are clinically significant. You don't know who those are going to show up in, but you know that's what's going to happen. So you ought to be thinking about that. If you're doing brain scans on 100 people or 1,000 people, you know some percentage are going to have a previously undiagnosed brain tumor. Okay, so unanticipated for that particular person, but on the whole, you know that's going to happen, and you better be thinking about that. You better have a plan for when that happens, because it will happen. So, that's the sort of domain that we're thinking about here. So different types of engagement: offers, requests, and then surprises. So what's the nature of the relationship between participants and investigators in research, and what ethical obligations are entailed? And I'm listing these questions now, and we're going to touch on these. So what are the benefits and risks of disclosure and non-disclosure, and what are the regulatory and legal issues that we need to think about? So if you're involved in a clinical research project that measures some aspect of your personal biology or physiology, would you expect to get the results back? It's a pretty sophisticated group here, but is that kind of something that you would normally expect?
If you got your check, you wouldn't be worried about it. Assuming you were paid to be a part of this study, you got your check, you wouldn't necessarily.
I'm sorry, are you saying you would not expect necessarily?
I would say that, if it's laid out at the front that the clinical research project you'll be reimbursed at such and such a rate for your time, and you got your check, most people would take the check.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure those two are necessarily mutually exclusive.
Well,
I don't know. So you'd look at the consent form, I'm guessing, and say, well, am I going to get it or not?
Yeah, I think that ahead of time, one should set the expectations for the participants. But if it's just, I've seen clinical research projects where they offer X number of dollars for so many, whatever, blood draws or days.
Yeah, that's pretty standard. Yeah. A couple $100 for participants.
I'd expect to have the option. I may not choose to exercise that option, but I'd want to have it.
Okay. Why do you think that? Why do you feel that way?
Because I'd want to be in control of that information for myself.
Feel a little nervous about somebody else having that information about you and not, and you not having it?
Well, I wouldn't participate if I was uncomfortable with people having information about me. But so
Yes,
if I'm willing to participate, I'm willing to give out that information. But I'd want to at least have the option of knowing if there was something actionable that they discover during.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
I feel like I would only want to know the results in context, so I wouldn't want to be given a bunch of results that then I have to think about interpreting on my own. If there's some kind of story that can be drawn for me, then maybe they're informative to me. But I'm a pretty paranoid person, so I feel like if somebody told me something, like with the pregnancy gene thing, and I didn't know how relevant it was or what the statistical significance of it was, that would throw me into a panic that I don't need to be in. So.
Okay. All right. So you want to sit down with somebody and have them say, here's your results, and this is what this means for you.
Yeah.
And what you ought to think about doing next based on this information. Doesn't that sound like your doctor?
Yeah. So, just so I understand correctly, whatever is being researched, that information is not available to the larger community. Is that correct?
I think generally I will say yes, if it's the experimental result that is the one we're talking about. a side issue, not necessarily a side issue. Sometimes you get regular clinical tests as part of research. You wouldn't otherwise get them, but because you're a research project, they're going to check your liver function test and make sure your liver's okay before we give you this experimental drug. Right? So there's those that are part of the standard clinical possibilities. But for the most part, you're right. They're not generally available to others in the public. Does that influence how you're thinking about what your expectations are?
Well, the angle that I'm kind of thinking of is this might be the only source of information that the person has. And that's, to me, that kind of tips more heavily in favor of disclosure, because even if they go to somebody else, that other person might not know.
Okay, I like that. And it actually goes in a little different direction than my assumptions. I thought you were saying because nobody else is getting this, then why should these people necessarily get communicated? But it's really the opposite sense. All right.
If there were potential for personal, important or actionable results, I want to have the option going.
Okay. And we're going to talk a lot about that, the notion that if it's going to be helpful for me in some way for my health care, and maybe a lower standard for things that I'm not going to use, I might want to know, but not particularly useful.
I don't mean to derail, but why? It seems like nobody wants their information or wants to give disclosure to another person who's participating in a study. Why? You get your life insurance quote, they take your blood. Yeah, I want to see what my blood looks like. I want to see what's in my blood. Everybody wants disclosure. Y'all want to know what's going on. Like, I feel like we're all shying away from this, maybe because we're a bunch of liability, not driven attorneys or something, but no one's really made an argument as to why they wouldn't exactly want this. Why would they participate in a study if they didn't have the expectation? It seems like, yeah, you're going to take my blood, you're going to see what's in it? Yeah, let me know.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to see the printout. If they do a blind study, which is a way to avoid liability, sure. You're not characterizing me versus my results. You're just taking my results and mixing them all together and seeing who turns out where. There's no way to disclose that, right? Because you don't know whose blood is what.
Right.
But in most cases, there are other characteristics of individuals that you're marketing or you're using as identifiers besides just the blood. And so, well, why isn't anyone addressing that? Why would you not want this? I guess is my question.
Okay. And I think I'm going to tell you you're right. That's in fact what the studies show. Pretty much not everybody, but almost everybody expects and wants this information. And it's a level of sometimes saying, well, maybe I can use this for my health care. Most of the time, I suspect it's just, you got it, I want it, I want it too. I'm curious. I spent my time and effort, and you're sticking me with needles. I want to know. So I think that point of view is on target. So here we're talking about spectrum of results, just to clarify what mostly the emphasis here is that I have today. And so you got public release of study data, return of general study results. And this is a big emerging domain in the field as well. And I can tell you that the literature is quite consistent here as well, where folks frequently involved in research, investigators are your best buddy. They get their samples, they complete their surveys, they're gone. You never hear from them again. So-called helicopter phenomenon, right? And they're gone. And people don't like that. People developed a certain relationship, had certain expectations. So there's a real emphasis now on trying to get back to participants on a much more consistent basis about the general study results. What did you find? And this may well be relevant to many sorts of research in which individual results may not be entirely appropriate. So that's the individual study results, and then the return of incidental findings, which has also one of the most controversial sets of issues, particularly in genetics right now. The imaging folks have been dealing with this for a long time, because what they found is if you do a MRI of somebody's abdomen, about 40% of those will have something that needs to be followed up with additional evaluations. So they get incidental findings or secondary findings a lot. But for this conversation, we're mostly focused on this question of individual study results to participants. So, traditional approach, no return of individual research results. That's pretty much the standard, and a lot of consent forms for a lot of years have simply said, we're not going to provide you with your results. The ethical obligations are uncertain. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Simply the lack of tradition, protocols, peer review, just not part of the fabric of what we've been doing for a long time. It's a complex task. You can't, and if you're a molecular biologist, then you're not the best person to talk to people about the health consequences of a particular genetic variant, right? You want a clinician who's an expert in that area. And how then do you engage people in the way in which they want to be engaged, which is to put their results in some context.
So in most studies then, is it a flat out statement in the consent form, we will not return results to you? Or do you find that they typically include some wiggle room? So if we do find something that is actionable that we think we might want to disclose to the patient, we have the option to do that as the study team.
I think increasingly in recent years, we're seeing some of that wiggle room, in particular from genetic studies. And I don't think I've seen any research that sort of looked at consent forms. I think just the experience with the IRB is, in past years, it was fairly boilerplate to say, we're uncertain what we're going to get here, so we're not going to give you any personal results. Now, of course, the point of this talk and the point of efforts in this domain are that environment is changing. So I think you'll see some changes emerging within some consent forms in certain domains to say there may be certain types of results you'll get back, or we may offer you results back in certain circumstances that would not have been the case, say, 15 years ago. Additional funding, okay? A topic in Washington today. Okay, literature suggests that participants want and expect a return of results. Made that point. I'll give you a little bit of data on this. This was a relatively recent study in the journal Clinical Trials. 2,500 people who had participated in clinical research, 33% said they had received results. Now, they didn't break that down in terms of what kinds of results, but as you read the paper, it sounds like a lot of it was general results from the study as opposed to individual results. But they asked the question of these folks, should researchers offer to give study results to participants? 61% yes always, 34% yes sometimes. So that's a 95% saying yes. Type of information included in results, 70% said they wanted results that are specific to me. That's not 100%, but it's a lot. A number of studies in this domain, but just to point out a couple, this is a genetic one, tumor profiling, looking for germline variants, meaning the constitutional genetics for the person, not the genetics of the tumor. 400 patients surveyed in an ambulatory oncology clinic at Yale. 77% wanted to be informed about variants for serious but preventable. 56 wanting information, variants serious but unpreventable. 49 wanted information about variants of unknown significance. So here's results that you don't know how to interpret, but still half the people want those too. So a little more sophisticated set of questions about, okay, let's think about what sorts of information you want. And for the most part, people want information. So cancer patients generally want information on incidental variants, but substantial variation. So this paper was suggesting, as we've discussed, clarify personal needs. Not everybody wants it, so in the consent process, you'll say, you may be offered these results, and at some point, you can decide whether you want those or not. So the federal regulations governing human subjects research do not address return of results. Now, there's some forthcoming changes to the regs that they keep putting off, but it's going to require investigators to inform patients whether results will be returned in certain circumstances. So that doesn't set any sort of standard to say, here's when you must return, here's when you should not return, but simple language within the consent form to address and inform participants about which way that's going to go. Office of Human Research Protections is OHRP, and their guidance does not address return of results either. So investigators don't really have guidance from the regulatory framework out there on this particular issue. So let's think for a second about this question that we've touched on, which is what's the nature of the relationship between investigators and participants? Lots of ethics over many years about the physician-patient relationship, but not nearly as much about this relationship. So clinicians have a fiduciary duty to promote the welfare of their patients, strong obligation to return test results that may have value to participants. So that's pretty straightforward. Generally believe that investigators do not have a fiduciary relationship. They're not dedicated to the welfare of the participant above all else or promoting the welfare. They're dedicated to a different enterprise, which is answering a question. So obligation to return to obtain informed consent, including what information will be returned, risks and benefits, etc. Obligation to follow the protocol, obligation to minimize harms, unclear obligation to promote benefits. The point here is that the research enterprise in which the investigator makes a commitment to try to not make you worse off than you were when you stepped into the project. Not necessarily to promote your interests when the opportunity arises. Perhaps an obligation to rescue as a general moral obligation in certain circumstances. So we all, let's say, have an obligation to rescue people in certain circumstances if it's not too much risk for us and we have the skill and ability to do that. That's a general obligation that each of us have. To what extent is it different in the research context would be the question.
What about instances where the clinician is the investigator?
That's an excellent question, and it very much confuses the circumstances. And so I don't think folks have thought through that complexity either. Although it is interesting, some institutions will, physically require the clinician to take off his or her white coat, and maybe put on a different hat to sort of visually illustrate that, okay, I've left that role, I'm now in a new role. But as we'll see here in a second, folks are widely confused those roles, and so particularly when that same individual serves those two functions, you would expect people to be confused about what's the deal.
So given that investigators don't usually have a fiduciary duty, to what extent have you seen them held responsible if they're wrong? Like if the woman that they believe didn't have a cancer marker actually did, and the operation would have saved her life without their intervention, what happens then?
Yeah, good question. What do you think should happen then?
Some liability, but not a lot given the standards.
Well, and perhaps much to the disappointment of this crowd, I'm not going to talk too much about liability, but you might expect that there would be an emerging standard of care that would say, if you give information to people, you made that decision, and that information proves to be wrong, and that error will significantly impact somebody's health, then you have a duty to respond to that. And that probably a duty that emerges out of the communication of the information as opposed to necessarily some broader obligation of investigators to promote the welfare of participants. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Question.
Yes.
I'm kind of amused that you characterize this duty as merely fiduciary. Is the medical world using fiduciary in a different way than we would think in the legal area?
Well, here the point is, I say clinicians do have a clear fiduciary.
But is it just fiduciary? Is it reducible to a financial interest?
Oh, I see. See, I would not interpret the fiduciary term to be purely financial.
Well, I think that you might be wrong. That's what I'm suggesting. Maybe the medical profession should adopt a different characterization of that duty than just merely fiduciary.
Okay.
A humanitarian would be, is it common humanity to have these kind of duties, not just fiduciary?
Okay. Well, I interpret the fiduciary term to mean, perhaps mistakenly, that you are dedicated to that person above all else. That is the focus of your service and focus of your interest is promoting that person's interest above all other interests, as opposed to any necessarily
financial.
Okay.
Well, that's interesting.
All right, and here's the last question that might be of interest to this group. Is it enough to obtain informed consent and follow through on what that commitment is? So if you say, we're not giving you any results, are you done? Or are there obligations broader than sort of do we want to look at the informed consent form sort of as a contract, and this is what the contract says, you signed it, you signed up, we're done? Or is there a more complicated relationship that we want to think about? And I think a lot of investigators very much like this last bullet, which is to say, my obligations are encompassed within this form that we put together that tells you what we're going to do. You agree to do it. We do or do not provide information, but that's the nature of our obligation is what's in this particular document. And I think a lot of people want to resist the notion that, you know, whatever you say is fine as long as people look at it, read it, sign it. So I've kind of made this point. Regulatory IRB emphasis has been on protection against risk. The goal is to make participants no worse off. Focus on benefits has been primarily on the benefits from the research intervention per se. So we're going to give you an experimental drug for your disease. We don't know whether it's going to work. We're going to answer that question. It's a safety and efficacy question. And maybe you'll benefit from it. And that'd really be wonderful. But maybe you'll be harmed by it. And that would be unfortunate, but it's what's helping us answer the question about safety and efficacy. So another point here that is at the center of this debate. So when results are not returned in research, again, that having been mostly the tradition, the informational risk from the research is pretty close to zero. I think the field in general has an excellent track record of protecting privacy and confidentiality, which are sort of the informational risks, and the risks that may be associated with people learning information that's upsetting or concerning, or misinterpreted. But if you don't tell them anything, that risk goes to zero. So the ethical challenge is to balance the benefits of disclosure versus the risks of disclosure. So we kind of added a whole new dimension to think and worry about then if we are going to provide information. So here are the key things in terms of the risks and benefits. Research results are often uncertain in terms of validity. And that validity can be several different levels here. Is the analysis accurate? We think we're measuring A. Does this test we're using actually measure A or not? Do the results tell us something about the current or future health of the participant, the clinical validity? This is a particular issue in genetics, but it's true in a lot of different fields. You measure some biomarker. How is that associated with the disease that you're concerned about? And that's an aspect of biology as much as the laboratory itself. And you have certain genetic mutations, for example, that are highly associated with disease. And pretty much if you've got a mutation in that gene, then highly probable that you're going to manifest this condition. Many others, most others, are much more probabilistic. And so we may not know the probabilities as we begin to identify variants associated with disease. It's too early. We need bigger studies longer term to ascertain the clinical validity of a particular result. And then are results useful for clinical or life decisions? And so this is characterized as, on the one hand, clinical utility, which is the doctor's view of the world. Can a doctor use it in some way to help you with your health, prevent disease or ameliorate disease? Or a concept now that's increasingly popular, which is personal utility. You use it in your life in some fashion to change your life. And so people, I think, have appropriately begun to criticize this distinction because it's not so much of a distinction. But people would say Huntington's disease, you can't do anything to prevent people from getting sick who have that mutation. They will get sick. But if you know you have this mutation when you're 30 years old, and you got, say, 10 more years before you're going to get sick, that'll impact how you lead your life. And it may impact whether you decide to have kids. It may impact a lot of very important things, even though it doesn't have clinical utility in the classic sense. So folks are pushing very hard to eliminate this somewhat artificial distinction between clinical utility and personal utility. And here's another point that's so interesting about the psychology of research participation. And this is the notion of the therapeutic misconception. And a lot of people who are involved in clinical research don't understand the distinction between clinical care, which is intended to provide them with benefit, and answer a research question, research exercise. And so they think that, well, I was randomized to this group in the study because my doctor thinks that's the best group for me. No, that's not right. But people's understanding of the research enterprise is limited, and so this is quite prevalent. And different studies will show, 30, 40, 50% of people involved in research have some element of this therapeutic misconception. So they ought to know, we ought to think, if you've got valid informed consent and folks are signing up for your study, they ought to know we're not providing you with health care. This isn't about you. It's about a question. And we're thankful that you're helping us answer that question as a volunteer, but that's not the point of our interactions. So the risk here, the concern here is that if you get into a relationship where you're returning results, counseling people about the results, then that's going to foster this misconception. And perhaps induce people to participate in research on sort of playing on their misconceptions because people think this is a route to healthcare, when in fact it may not. So this is a very important concern. So communication of individual results may lead individuals, this is the risks, make inappropriate healthcare decisions based on wrong information. Create a legal liability for investigators or institutions for communicating false or misleading information. Not a whole lot of case law in this particular domain yet, but unnecessary anxiety, worry people without good cause because your test proved not to be valid. Burden the research enterprise with new costs and complexities, and reduce the volume of research potentially conducted because resources are now being used to return results instead of do more research. So how do we balance these sorts of considerations is the central challenge. The benefits. Participants may receive information valuable to their healthcare and life decisions. That's the utility argument. Participants will feel respected through more robust partnership and research involving reciprocity and transparency. They're doing something for you, and you may be cutting them a check, but still, the notion is, what can we do in return? And we don't know this yet. This is an empirical question, but return results may enhance the recruitment or retention in research. We know there's a big problem with the conduct of clinical research, with many studies that are not completed for lack of recruitment and lack of retention. Folks drop out. We don't know to what extent that's because they felt misled or they felt that they misunderstood what the enterprise was all about, and so the research ultimately fails because the lack of a robust relationship between the participants involved and the investigators. So what we're seeing and what I think the general movement is in the whole domain is that return of results is being seen as one element in a changing culture of research towards a true partnership. People want to see a much more respectful relationship between the participant community and the research community, and that may include a whole variety of ways to enhance that relationship and collaboration, but one element might well be return of individual results when appropriate, as a way of meeting people's needs and expectations. So here's a little bit more about CLIA. Many research-based tests are not conducted in CLIA-certified labs. CLIA certification requires meeting a complex set of quality and oversight standards, and it's expensive for research laboratories and institutions. It requires additional personnel, lots of additional quality checks along the whole line. And you might imagine if you're running a laboratory that's routinely doing clinical tests for patients, you want the highest quality standards to be in that particular lab. If you're an investigator running a lab, trying to answer research questions, basic science questions, CLIA certification is not that important to you, or not important at all, because it's so complicated and expensive to achieve. So lots of research labs don't have that level of quality assurance. Now, the potential downside for that too is that there's a crisis of sorts for reproducibility with the research enterprise. And lots of studies can't be reproduced. So So there's some line of thinking to say, some of that may well be due to relatively poor quality standards in research laboratories, that those results cannot be reproduced. So maybe there's an impetus to improve overall the quality of laboratory standards in research laboratories, perhaps not to achieve a level of CLIA certification, but perhaps to increase the reproducibility of the science. Now, there's been an exception. Rules do not apply. CLIA rules don't apply to components or functions of research laboratories that test human specimens, but do not report patient-specific results for the diagnosis, prevention, or treatment of a disease or impairment, assessment of the health of individuals. So if you're not giving results back that are being used, if you're not giving results back, you're not trying to influence somebody's clinical care, then you don't have to have CLIA certification. Again, that's why many labs don't pursue that. They don't need it. So here's HIPAA, though, and here's the conflict. HIPAA states individuals have a right of access to inspect and obtain a copy of their protected health information, PHI, contained within a designated record set in a HIPAA-covered entity. But before 2014, laboratories were excluded from HIPAA access. 2014 amendments to both CLIA and HIPAA changed that. Health and Human Services eliminated the laboratory exclusion from the HIPAA access rule. So what does that mean? If a research participant asks the laboratory, I want my results, they're required to provide those results. And what those amendments did not do is describe anything about what the nature of that communication needs to look like. So a lot of laboratories in the genetics field are saying, well, it's probably easiest for us just to give them the whole, if we did a whole genome sequence, we just give them a thumb drive with the whole sequence on it. We don't have to interpret it. The HIPAA says you don't have to interpret the results to return it. Maybe you get into trouble if you're trying to do interpretation if it's not required. So is that the kind of right that really promotes individual welfare? Now, we know a lot of folks, very few folks end up requesting their information, but should this access right become more widely recognized, many more folks may want to access that information. And they'll take their thumb drive with their sequence and go down to Larry's sequence shop on Foothill and get an interpretation. So you see the conflict that's developing here. HIPAA seeks to enable access to an individual's health information, promote transparency, trust, patient welfare. And you can see this philosophy reflected in the language. We think this is going to promote public welfare to enable this sort of communication. CLIA, however, has a very different view. They seek to promote high-quality laboratory services and reduce the risk of false or misleading information. So what if a research participant requests her results from a laboratory who uses a non-CLIA certified investigator who uses a non-CLIA certified laboratory? Where does that put the investigator? HIPAA says you got to give it to them. CLIA says don't you dare. So this is untenable, unacceptable. Now, what some authors have contended was this, that the return of research results to participants from non-CLIA certified labs is acceptable when the results are clearly described as experimental. Not intended for their clinical use, but they should confirm it in a CLIA certified lab. Any problems with that? So it's an intermediate, it's trying to compromise, to say, don't use this information for clinical services, but we're going to tell it to you, and you need to go get this confirmed in a regular clinical CLIA certified laboratory to make sure that it's accurate. And it's an issue both of sort of the quality analysis itself, but also the process by which samples are obtained. CLIA requires a rigorous chain of custody, if you will, from that sample from the person into the laboratory, whereas research laboratories don't necessarily have that same rigor. So what the CLIA folks are always concerned about is you may have an accurate result, but on the wrong person. And you're giving your result back to the wrong person, that's a problem.
I just had a thought, this confirmation using CLIA is a good idea, but one of the issues that I've seen firsthand is that then it takes time to get confirmation in CLIA, which if you're dealing with serious medical things, could be an issue. And then also, money to do so.
Well, and I think that's such an important point because I think it's a very frequent circumstance. And you can look at some of these genetic tests that you can get commercially for, let's say, $3,000. And the lab is telling you, well, we got this finding that you may want to confirm in a regular lab. It may well be the participant who says, you know, I'm going to trust you guys rather than spend $3,000 to confirm. Then they're going to use it clinically, and so this strategy then doesn't work very well.
Does the certification have to be disclosed in the consent form? Like, do they say we're testing this in a CLIA-certified lab or a non-certified lab? Like, in that consent form, and kind of define what that means for the participants before they kind of enter into this?
I don't think I've ever seen that level of detail in a consent form. Now, the IRB may ask that question of the investigator. You say you're returning these results, is your lab CLIA certified or not? And so there'll be a peer review oversight of that element. But I think that rarely gets into the consent form per se. So here's something interesting. I was on SACHARP and chaired SACHARP, Secretary's Advisory Committee for Human Research Protections, for a number of years. And so we tried to deal with this issue. And so we had the CMS folks come. They're the governors of CLIA. And they presented this as a misconception. They said if a clinical lab has an IRB approval, patients are notified their testing is investigational. Is it not necessary for the testing to be performed in a CLIA-certified laboratory? True or false? And their answer is false. So to interpret that alternative scenario that I just outlined, the CMS folks said you cannot do that. You cannot tell people anything. You can't tell them you got a preliminary experimental finding that they need to confirm, because that's the communication of results, and that's prohibited under the regs. So this is how they've interpreted their regs. And a lot of other folks say, we think you ought to interpret it differently, but they're sticking with it. And our committee, as part of the National Academies, has been invited. Interestingly, we've been invited specifically not to tell them that their interpretation is wrong, but potentially to tell them that the regulations themselves should change if we end up thinking that that's the way to go. So they've eliminated that end run. And SACHARP has this statement that basically says we think that's not ethically appropriate. We think researchers who identify clinically actionable information from the results of research tests conducted in a non-CLIA certified lab should be able, without legal penalty, to refer a subject to a CLIA certified lab for additional testing. Enable the subject to obtain such information through clinically reliable means. So our group and a number of groups were sort of pushing on this notion that to say that this was the right ethical decision to be made, but nothing's changed since our statements are. So here's an emerging consensus. The harmonization of CLIA and HIPAA is essential. We got to figure out which way do we, as a society, want to go with this kind of information. Do we want to promote it, despite concerns about validity, or do we want to prohibit it to maintain our protection of people against false or misleading results? Whether to offer research results to participants depends on a whole number of variables that we've already touched on. The validity and utility of the results, meaning the value to the participants, preferences of the participant group, preferences of the participants, of course, and then the feasibility issues. Whether to return results upon the request of the participant depends on evolving interpretations of HIPAA and CLIA. So this was one of the first groups to have something to say about this issue. The National Bioethics Advisory Commission back in 1999. Appropriate to return results only if the findings are scientifically valid and confirmed. Findings have significant implications for the subject's health concerns, and a course of action to ameliorate or treat these concerns is readily available. So you notice this is a pretty high standard. This has been the standard for a number of years, and a lot of research environments don't meet these standards because it takes time to find out whether your results are valid and confirmed. and debates about, how much implication for my health is enough, et cetera.
I have a question about that, Jeff.
Yeah.
And that first bullet point, scientifically valid and confirmed, it seems like, how do you define those criteria? As you would previously have defined them, or, because that's pretty open-ended.
It is, and they had a lot of language about, how they thought those ideas ought to be considered at the time. But it's still an open question, and I think it's still a matter of sufficient validity and sufficient, probably in the context of the individual study. I'll tell you this, certainly where our group is going with this most recent discussion, that because you cannot make, you cannot define these in clear, specific terms to say, here's our 10 criteria, that's almost always context specific, that you want to move from a sort of objective standard into a process approach. Have a peer review group look at the particular context you're talking about and help make determinations about whether in this particular context it's should be considered valid and confirmed. So President's Commission 2013, and they were really looking at incidental and secondary findings, but I think the issue are similar. Researchers, they said, recommendation 12 should develop a plan to manage anticipatable incidental findings, including but not limited to those findings known to be significant and clinically actionable. When relevant, analytically valid, and clinically valid. Plans should be reviewed and approved by institutional review boards. So this just makes that same point. To move it out of trying to establish clear standards and try to establish a process by which the issues can be addressed on a case-by-case basis. So, pesticide case, remember that one? An hour ago. Investigators worked extensively with the community to address their preferences about both whether and how to return results. And as expected, the community was very interested in their results. So they held 2 community town forums to get input on the communication strategy. Of the 100 families who participated in research, they could locate 91 4 years later, and they presented the results to the families on a house-by-house basis. They had somebody come to each home of a participant in that community and explain the results. Later, in follow-up, people remembered being given the results. They had read and used the educational materials that were part of that presentation. And they had good levels of knowledge about how to protect themselves and their families from pesticide exposure. So I think this reflects really a point that somebody made here earlier, which is the advantages are layered. Even if you can't respond to that particular pesticide level in your system, it alerts you. You're now engaged in a relationship with these investigators, and you're attentive to these educational materials. And it's, okay, I get it. And this is it. So it's not some general message about, wear protective gear for pesticides exposure. It's like you're a 15 on this scale, and so here's what you can do to protect yourself and your family. So I think the notion is that it enhances the quality of the communication and the message by having a personal result that's part of that spectrum.
I was just going to ask what the reason was for was the 4-year difference just how long the study took and how long it took to find those families, or what was the?
I think it was how long it took to do the study.
Okay.
Yeah, just because, that was the explanation there. Here's the tool they came up with as a communication tool in collaboration with the community itself. So this notion that if your blood so here's the spectrum of blood level in your urine, and they kind of got the notion of as a thermometer sort of tool is the what they decided on. And that very top observational level is where pesticide levels are too high for field workers. People have to be pulled out of the field in that environment. Most of the folks, they said, were more into this green to green-yellow area, and then the ordinary national level, since we all get some exposure here and there, was there. And this proved to be a useful tool for folks. So again, emphasizing how the multi-layered approach with the community both to engage them around the research itself, of course, but then to sit down and communicate with tools that have been developed in part through collaboration with the community itself, proved to be very valuable. And I would say, based on my look at the literature, that the environmental health folks are taking this set of issues much more seriously than a lot of other domains in science. And I think to some extent there's been sort of a social justice frame of mind with a lot of folks who are in the environmental health field that has moved them towards wanting to be more robustly collaborative with the participant community than other areas of science. So finally, my conclusions. No regulations or HRP guidance on this issue, so extent of the ethical obligations really remain uncertain. I think we need to continue to think about how do we want to characterize that relationship between investigators and participants. And of course, that's not a single thing, because if you're accessing a biobank with de-identified specimens, that's a different relationship than if you're simultaneously the doctor of this person who you want to be a participant in your study. Regulatory requirements are in conflict. More research and experience necessary to balance the burden of information to participants. We don't know how to really do this in most effective ways yet, so we need research on the research to be able to do the best job with this. And then I think a broad social movement towards more robust partnership with participants is going to foster more return of results. I do see the field moving in that direction, with still lots of work to slice and dice and figure out when is it most appropriate, when is it not appropriate or not necessary, and what processes do we want on a study-specific basis to help people make those decisions. Okay, thank you.
More questions and dialogue are welcome.
Steve?
More?
Is there any literature on investigators' attitudes toward returning genetic results, for example?
Yes, and I know of at least one that included genetics professionals. It was both geneticists and genetic counselors. And for the most part, there was a not as robust as the participant group itself, but probably 50% of folks who thought this was an appropriate and good idea. So a solid group, but not resounding. What's your sense in the community of how people are thinking about this?
I think it depends on how close they are to the participant. So people that have a long-standing relationship with the participant probably have a little more interest in obligation almost to return results versus someone that's not.
Yeah.
You just have to, it's the issue of wanting to do it from an ethical obligation and then operationalizing it. It's very difficult to operationalize.
Yeah. Well, that's where we as an institution need to be thinking about how to support investigators. So if you just say, Steve, that's your job, figure it out, that's not so helpful. But increasingly we ought to be looking to institutional infrastructures to say, we can help you engage with this community. We have scholars in communication and strategies to assist with developing this. And so it's not like, where do I start? I'm interested in doing work on this disease. So I think it's an institutional responsibility.
Okay. So my question is, you mentioned that there's no real guidance or regulations or anything, and so obviously you guys are gonna release your research and your understanding. But on a lab-to-lab basis, like how do people make these decisions? How do they make the call? Is there like sort of a best practices sort of thing? Do people tend to lean towards like more disclosure or less disclosure? Is it kind of all over the place?
Yeah, and I don't know how to answer that. That's a very good question. I don't have a good feel for what the landscape is out there. I think maybe to some extent now, because IRBs are starting to ask that question, are you going to return your results? And if your answer is yes, then you need to describe a little bit about how that goes. I think there's maybe a little bit of institutional pressure to be more consistent about at least addressing it. But I'm going to guess that some of it is just personal tradition, how people learn to do science, what other people in their environment do, and if it's part of that environment, then folks are going to say, well, that sounds, I'll do that too, kind of thing. So I'm going to guess it's very spotty, but I don't actually have any information to verify that opinion.
I have a question. I was wondering if you could, has there been much discussion about like what's an appropriate timeline, particularly for patients that are part of studies where whole exome sequencing is being done? So we have a study that I work on where this is being done. We have a plan to return results and resources to address that. We've found already that there's a much higher percentage of patients with findings than would have been expected. And it is very interesting, but you know, we've had a discussion like what is an appropriate timeline. Obviously, we're going to try to get that information to genetic counseling as quickly as possible, but has there been any discussion on timing?
No, probably not much beyond stuff that's probably relatively obvious. And if you're talking about, you know, you do a CBC before you start a drug and somebody's got, you know, huge white count, you know that's going to be something you need to disclose today or tomorrow. In other circumstances, like genetic information, typically that may be important information, but rarely do you need to know it in the next month or two. So you can spend a little bit of time strategizing about that issue. And so I think the timing mostly tends to be context specific. Literature out there and other groups that have suggested, ask the question, when does your responsibility end? And I think the general consensus is once the project ends, then any responsibility to track down folks in the future probably ends too. Now that tends to relate to circumstances where you may give somebody a result and you've interpreted it in a certain way and that interpretation changes and now it's 5 years down the road. Do you have an ethical obligation to go back as a investigator and track those folks down or not? You don't have funding for the project anymore. So I think there's a lot of uncertain questions in that domain about that tail end responsibility. Leslie, do you want to take folks on here?
What about a continuation of that where, say, it's unlikely to happen, but say years down the road somebody comes in and tries to seek out those results, and is there any residual responsibility when, say, the individual who gave up the data is doing the seeking and not the party that has all the data?
Yeah, and I think that's where the groups are wanting to say you have to put an endpoint on it at some point, and that once the project's over. Now that may differ for the institution, and this is the whole complexity about, you know, what's a designated record set, and HIPAA's never adequately defined that. And one consideration for our group is to suggest HIPAA define that in a way that suggests that research results that really are not designed for clinical care be designated as outside the designated record set, in which case it may not be accessible upon request. All of that's very much up in discussion at this point. But I think the general answer is folks want to have an endpoint to say that relationship ends, which I think is different than what it might well be in that clinical circumstance.
When investigators just decide to disclose the research to participants, do you know if they're more likely to just disclose the raw data, or are they likely to take the extra step, like in the case of with pesticides, and explain the data to them?
I think much more likely the latter. Again, it may depend on the particular circumstance, but and the resources available. But I think the expectation would be for that to be a meaningful communication. Somebody has to put that in context for you. What does a 15 mean? And what am I supposed to do now? And that, of course, is the complexity, because you have to have somebody who's got the right expertise to make that sort of communication. Lots of lay advocacy groups out there for different disease conditions too, who can be partners in this as well, and develop educational materials that can help folks interpret some of these things.
Is your committee making any recommendations related to what happens with secondary research on electronic medical records when patients become participants but have never been presented with a consent form of any kind related to whatever individual research project an investigator is up to?
Fortunately not. Yeah, that's a complicated set of issues, and our purview is with biospecimens. So, that's a lot of stuff. It's not imaging, it's not electronic data sets, not those sorts of things. I think a lot of the same principles will apply, but we're also not looking at sort of social behavioral research, which I think the social behavior folks will not be happy about. But again, I think the report's going to make the statement that here's our focus, but a lot of the same concepts will apply in other domains.
So we've got Kate and Linda.
Just going back one question, talking about community advocacy agencies, I was curious on the pesticides example, who actually returned the results? Did they partner with an agency or public health folks, or kind of what did that look like, actually communicating the information as opposed to just translating it?
Good. And they had actually some trained individuals who were Spanish speaking and familiar enough with local community standards and cultural values to go into those homes and do that communication. So they had to be trained to do that. So they weren't scientists, but they were people who had a specific term for it in Spanish that I don't recall, but that was their mechanism. And I think that was also part of the discussion that they had with the community. Who would you feel comfortable coming into your home and talking to you about these sorts of things? And so that was an element of the communication strategy they developed.
With the pesticide example that you've given, could it become so prohibitively expensive to be giving out this kind of information, have people individually going to homes, that it could affect the kind of research being done, do you think?
Yes, and so that's a serious concern. This was 100 families in a particular location. You might well say, let's imagine this had been entirely up the entire agricultural valley of California, and they enrolled 2,000 people, and there were 6 different languages. Then we're talking about really a monumental project to address that communication concern, and folks might reasonably say, if that becomes the standard and we have to do this, then we're not going to be doing a whole lot of pesticide research because we're going to spend all our money in communicating the results from the first project. And so that sort of trade-off is important. We've heard lay advocates want to say that, well, we've heard 2 things. There's a mother of we get public testimony for this process, and had a mother of a child with muscular dystrophy. And so folks were asking questions. Asked her a specific question. If the return of results required resources that might reduce the amount of research that was being done in this field, there was just no question. She had a very quick answer. She said, we are so into, at this point, a cure. We want the research to move forward. Communication of results as a secondary value do not impair the research enterprise. Whereas others have made a very different argument to say this is an essential element of the relationship that's emerging between participants, and don't assume people can't understand the information, because they can. You do it in the right way, and people should not, and that we don't want to look at it purely as a trade-off and allow investigators simply to say, it's too hard, I'm not going to do it. The notion would be, if this is important, mobilize the resources in some way that it doesn't necessarily make that harder trade-off. Now, of course, that's true for a lot of values that we have in society about. A lot of things are important, and so trade-offs are real, but that's where some of the advocates are coming from, to say, let's not look at this as purely a trade-off, because that's not the right way.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Refreshments will be coming in. Stick around for informal conversation. And in addition, if you are a lawyer and you want continuing CLE, there is a sign-in.